Thank you for joining us for this next session of the ACC South Carolina Chapter Virtual Annual Meeting. We are very excited to have Haynesworth Sinclair Boyd with us today, not only as a sponsor of our chapter, but also to present on this very timely topic, workplace morale during a pandemic. So without further ado, well, before we get started, a couple things to remember. Submit all questions using that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We're going to answer those throughout the presentation and then also have a minute towards the end to answer any questions. You also be sure to attend throughout the entire webinar. We have a question at the very end you'll need to answer to receive CLE credit. And just keep those things in mind throughout. And Keely.
So Kelsey, is it all right if I go ahead and speak while y'all are passing off the baton? All right. My name is Chris Kent Sorensen. I know a lot of you were excited to have you all here with us today. We wish we could see you. I think the last time I saw all of y'all was a couple of years ago when you were here in Greenville. And we were talking about workplace culture, maybe not in the context of the pandemic, but workplace culture nonetheless. And so it's great to be back here. I'm here with my colleague, Perry McLennan, and also Lucy Henry from First Sun. A little bit about me and Perry. He and I are both on the HSB employment law team, and we're what we refer to each other as garden variety employment lawyers. We do all kinds of employment law compliance issues for employers, with the exception of labor. Perry and I are frequent presenters, trainers for employers, bloggers, and podcasters. And so our blog can be accessed on the HSB website page. Keely, if you'll click one over for me. At the HSB COVID-19 resource page, as well as our South Carolina employersblog.com. And I'm going to drop that address in the chat box here in a little bit. I would encourage you to follow that, because that is something that we've been doing for some time. We cover up anything that comes up in the employment law world that employers and HR professionals need to know long before COVID, and have heard that it's a good resource. So we would encourage you to follow it. The other thing that we do is podcasts, which Perry and I started last year and we just love. We joined Steve Nail and Kelly Scheib on Survive HR podcast, and you can get that podcast on either Spotify or iTunes. I would encourage you to check it out. It's 20 minutes. It's a lighter version, still covering compliance and the law. And, you know, just, I know it sounds like, I mean, we're on there some of the times, not all the times, but I think it's actually really fun. I think you'll enjoy it. And so with that, I'll also talk to you about Lucy Henry. I've known Lucy for a long time, and I came to know Lucy actually when I saw her speaking at GSHRM on suicide prevention and depression and such. And so Lucy is actually a licensed counselor as well as vice president at First Sun. Her role at First Sun at this time is working with First Sun stakeholders and the members and engaging in training and development activities to their audiences. Her company, along with the other folks that are in the company, obviously provide the employee assistance program advice and assistance to employees, and they're excellent. I know for a fact they're excellent, which is of course why we always partner with Lucy as often as we can. We did so particularly this time though, when Perry and I found that you wanted the two of us to talk to you about workplace morale. I mean, I think you're in trouble when you're asking lawyers to talk to you about workplace morale, so we thought we better ask Lucy to join us. As we said, Perry and I will answer the compliance questions as one or the other is talking as much as we can in the Q&A, so drop them in the chat box. We're glad to follow up with anything offline. And with that, I will hand it off to Perry.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I see a lot of familiar names on the attendee list, people that I've worked with over the years and gotten to know over the years. I hate that we can't be there in person today and socialize with some of you, but hopefully you'll find this presentation instructive. This is a little bit of a different presentation for us. Chris and I have been doing a lot of presentations to HR groups about how to comply with the new leave law and COVID safety guidance and all of that kind of stuff. And so we thought we'd do something a little bit different today and talk really about positive workplace trends that are coming out of the COVID pandemic. And I'm hopeful that even if some of the information in here might not be practical for you on a day-to-day basis, I hope you find it interesting as far as what's going on in the workplace. So just a quick overview of kind of where things stand from a big picture perspective. Most of you know the economy is slowly recovering. Unemployment is decreasing. Businesses are opening back up across the country. But I think the important thing to note is that workers are going back to an office or a place of work that looks much, much different than pre-pandemic. There's new policies, there's new safety guidance, there is new laws to comply with and things of that nature. What Chris and I are seeing is that from the business side of things, that concerns about liability continue to dominate the questions we get. And that's both really from a safety standpoint and concerns about being sued by an employee or a third party because we didn't take adequate safety measures, but also just routine employment decisions like, we've got to fire this employee, but they were out 3 weeks ago for COVID. Are they going to blame their termination on retaliation for taking COVID leave or something like that? So that's where we're fielding a lot of our questions. The school situation has complicated the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which was the federal leave law that went into effect earlier this year. Fortunately, we did get some recent guidance from the Department of Labor that cleared a lot of that up, but I'm still getting some sort of tricky questions from clients about leave issues related to parents that are staying home to take part in virtual learning. Litigation-wise, we are seeing an uptick in litigation across the country from employees on COVID-related issues. As of this morning, there's a few websites online that aggregate the litigation statistics, and it looks like around 675 lawsuits across the country filed against employers by employees directly related to COVID-19. And we have about 10 in South Carolina. Now, that's just filed lawsuits that we know about. Anecdotally, I've had a lot of calls from clients that have terminated people or denied requests for leave or things like that, that have negotiated with employees in sort of that pre-suit phase. And so there's a lot of that going on. So the numbers may be a little bit misleading. Importantly, some of you are probably watching this. There is still pending legislation before the South Carolina General Assembly, which has reconvened here in September. You may have been getting notices from the Chamber of Commerce and the Manufacturers Alliance and industry groups like that are pushing this liability bill. South Carolina is the only state of our neighboring states in the Southeast that has not passed a statewide COVID-19 liability protection statute. And essentially what that does is provides that COVID-19 related illnesses from employees that workers' comp is their exclusive remedy. So there's no direct legal action against employers. And it also provides that if if employers, businesses follow DHEC, CDC, OSHA guidelines, that there's a presumption that they acted reasonably and not negligently to protect them from third-party lawsuits. So Not sure what the chances are of that passing, but that is still pending, and it could help if it's passed. Most pertinent to our discussion today, I think, and this really fascinates me, and I've been doing a lot of reading about this, is that COVID-19 really has accelerated a lot of the existing trends that we've seen in the workplace in the U.S. Remote work, which we'll talk about, the increased demands really that we're seeing on working parents, and protections for vulnerable workers. The unemployment rate is disproportionately affecting those low wage earners in hospitality or retail, those types of industries that have not been open, whereas the white collar workforce has largely been insulated from a lot of the cuts. So we thought we would do 5 positive workplace trends to try to keep this on a positive note for everyone. And I think some of these are really interesting. I'll jump right into the first one, which is flexibility for employees. For years, we have seen, particularly among the younger workforce, the millennial generation, that flexible work arrangements have really been a top priority for job seekers. And that sometimes is place number one over things like compensation. It is very important, particularly to the younger generation, but we see it with older workers who are potentially putting off retirement as well. And, businesses have been a little bit, I say adapt here, but I really mean businesses have been hesitant to adopt flexible work arrangements. And we'll talk about some of the reasons for that, but COVID-19 has really changed everything. Sometimes necessity breeds ingenuity, and businesses really, due to government shutdowns, have had no choice but to operate in a remote environment. This change really does have massive ramifications across all industries and really all different areas of the workplace, including what many of you all do on the legal and the compliance side. But it's benefits, it's recruiting, it's security, it's a lot of different areas that are impacted by this. I mean, this is a pretty big shift in the way that we work as a country. Obviously, there's pros and cons. I mean, you all are probably like me. You've read articles in newspapers and magazines and on the internet about, oh, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened to the workplace, or no, we're just going to revert right back. This is not so good. And I think it's fair and balanced to say that that there are certainly risks, but there's also benefits. And I think the successful organizations of the future are ones that are really going to navigate that, successfully in the best manner possible. When we talk about flexibility for employees and flexible work arrangements, we often think about remote work, just remote from, work from home type of arrangements, which is true, but it's broader than that. I mean, it means alternative schedule arrangements. Maybe you're on the same general schedule, but you sort of have a freedom from the rigid work hours and the in-person appearances at conferences and meetings and things like that. So it can mean a lot of different things, but I generally like to think about it as sort of flexibility in the way that you police, so to speak, in-person attendance at the workplace. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal in the weekend version a few weekends ago that highlighted some of the downsides, taking the sort of contrarian viewpoint to all of this. But I think that generally speaking, this is seen as a positive for the labor force, and we'll talk about those reasons now. Obviously, this means that employees are empowered in the sense that they're not bound by geographic limitations. So if you're software developer in Charleston, and you can go work for a company in California or something like that and work from Sullivan's Island. That's great. Work-life balance, I have a question mark by that, because on first glance, this seems to be great for work-life balance. But as we'll talk about, there is some research suggesting that bringing work home in a remote environment that does not always lead to a better work-life balance, and could lead to you working more. Certainly opportunities for working parents, disabled individuals, traditionally underrepresented groups. There is an argument here that a rigid workplace without flexibility as far as hours goes disadvantages those groups. So this could be a real opportunity for diversifying your organization. Hopefully this causes companies to focus a lot more closely on tangible items like work product and performance, and not sort of how many hours are you billing, how many hours are you in the office, how much face time are you putting in at meetings and things like that. And of course, decreased costs for employees, transportation, childcare, et cetera. So I'll toss it over to Chris to talk a little bit about a little bit more on the company side of how teleworking actually works.
Thanks, Perry. And I will add to Perry's good comments about flexibility, in addition to increasing the footprint to include workers with disabilities, mobility issues, or child rearing responsibilities. Employers who rely on remote work, studies have suggested that they're less likely to hire workers who only look and sound like the majority of their team on the ground. It's believed that it levels communication playing field, and also suits employees' differences in work styles or individual styles and strengths. And so, there's a lot of good to say about remote work. It's just not for every business. Some businesses were already using remote work and telework as an option for workers prior to the pandemic, and did so quite successfully. While, as Perry noted, a lot of others had to figure out how to do it and get up to speed as soon as the shelter-at-home orders came down. And so it's important that employers figure out what works best for them. But, and Perry's going to hit on the Unum study later, so forgive me for mentioning it here. I was fascinated when I heard about that study, because it found that 3/4 of the workers actually were more productive remotely than in the office, while 1/4 was not. I think in that situation, it's going to require the employer to decide what works for them best. Remote work works great when you can quantify production and performance, for instance, with commission goals, numerical goals, a certain number of claims closed, those sorts of things. But if the metrics don't permit you to ascertain whether the work is getting performed properly, then maybe remote work isn't right, or maybe it's right for some positions and not others. But from a COVID standpoint, honoring remote work for the positions, as long as you're doing so consistently across the classification, honoring it for those positions that it's conducive to, also frees up more space in the workplace to keep your workers that have to have boots on the ground safe. So there's every kind of reason that we've both discussed about why you would consider it. Some of the things that you've got to watch out for is obviously the abuse of it, the leave abuse, and it's really hard to monitor. You think it's hard to monitor on ground. It becomes more difficult to monitor. I would say Perry's and my advice and counsel through a good bit of the summer, after we got over the hurdle of helping folks with COVID compliance, was the leave abuse, and it continues to be. I mean, it is a chronic issue. Security and theft of your information, might not be something that's on the forefront of employers' minds. And so I'm going to address that a little more in depth a bit further into the presentation. Engagement, obviously, that 1/4 of the Unum's workforce. And if you heard the news today, Chase Morgan Bank is having everybody come back into work because they were finding that Monday and Friday weren't very productive, while Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday were. I'm sure that there's a lot of loafing and types of things that you'd want to avoid in a situation with remote work. And you can't very well have different rules for different employees in the same classification. So it's just going to have to be something that the employer is looking at as far as how their workforce is engaged and performing. And how do you monitor for compliance? And then finally, performance evaluations. And I'm going to suggest here, though, that it's an opportunity to really clean up your performance evaluations. So often what I see when I'm looking at a personnel file when we find ourselves defending a company in employment litigation is that these performance reviews are the same ones you're used to seeing, rank 1 to 5 on these 5 categories. You can turn your performance evaluation into a fabulous tool to push the mission of the company. You can turn your performance evaluation into a tool that addresses diversity inclusion issues for managers. You can attack those things in the performance evaluations that you're trying to, the movements that you're trying to instigate at work, not just how I did when I put the widget on this piece of whatever. So it's important to think in, broader terms as far as how you can use your performance management tool to suggest to particularly your management employees that this is an important mission for the company. We expect you to excel in these areas. So next slide, Keely. Some of the benefits, and Perry hit on some of these as far as some of the benefits for flexibility are the same benefits for why you would want to have remote work or telework. But I do hear particularly a number of younger employees that are desirable to have in the workplace. Skill sets are great. They're saying, just as they were saying before, they don't believe in the 5-day work week. They'd rather do a 4-day work week. They're looking for flexibility. The telework aspect of it is now layered in. And if you've got someone who is a good employee and they're working well remotely, it may be worth deciding whether or not remote work is something that you're going to sustain past COVID. While you might choose to do that, if you're doing it consistently through the classification, then it's going to require the harder work of addressing non-performance issues for those who are abusing the remote work. Some employers, some advisors are making recommendations that you would evaluate the specific employee for remote work after you evaluated whether or not the job worked. I'm not entirely opposed to that as long as the reasons for the inability to grant a remote work request are sufficiently articulated in writing with the employee, have been so and documented in the personnel file with them, not able to correct it. And also the issues that are associated are detailed enough to where they won't leave any wiggle room for the EEOC or South Carolina Human Affairs Commission to decide that it was on the basis of some other factor that's a protected class. So other things that you might think about as far as why you would do remote work would be recruiting. Just before the pandemic, we were in a tight labor market. And so Perry and I were saying these same things as far as how you can help increase some opportunities for employers hiring good employees. I know so many of the HR professionals that I work with were saying over and over again, we're scraping the bottom of the barrel, we're scraping the bottom of the barrel. And so this is going to be a great recruiting tool for moving forward. And I will say to you, I think if there's a way for you to do it, you should, because you don't want to be left behind in this. So next slide, please. So we talked about analyzing the positions. These are some of the examples of flexible work that you can do. If you can't do telework, think about job share. Job share is something that's great for people who have child caring responsibilities or people who are more close towards the end of their career. They no longer want to have a full schedule, but they'd like to keep working. Maybe you have 2 folks in that position that are in that, that are desiring to do the same. You've got that ability, that experience that's there. They're still helping the company succeed. They're training those that are coming along behind them, but they're also being able to meet some of their needs and or desires for their later careers. Split shifts for folks that are on the ground. If you're in a production facility, that's a great idea. Or part-time shifts. These sorts of things are all possible. Granted, more logistic nightmares, but time spent in using the pandemic to create this type of workforce will only be helpful later when we're back to hopefully get back to a tight labor market. And then, of course, the additional ideas of gig economy and other types of contingent and non-traditional workers as a way to fill in. Next slide. So the things you need to do though, if you are going to offer remote work, is you need to have a policy and you need to have a contract. And when I say contract, I don't mean one that changes the nature of the at-will employment relationship, but instead one that details specifically what the employee agrees to do and what the obligations are of the employee and not of the employer. So the policies would need to make it very clear about when you're allowed to remote work and when you're not. You know, think past pandemic. Think into situations where you have someone out on FMLA. If it's an exempt employee and they're out on FMLA and you allow them to remote work and they work about 5 minutes in a day, what are you going to do about that? That employee's got to be paid. You've got to be able to quantify what amount was work versus what amount was PTO. You've got to credit back that amount of time that was spent doing the work remotely. In the exempt, you have to credit it back to the FMLA bank as well as the PTO bank. You know, these are all things that you would have thought about before when you issued a remote work policy so that you would avoid leave abuse. In some situations, depending on what the situation is and why there is a medical leave, you might not want an employee working while they're remote. You could have some sort of disability claims. If you permit too many folks to work remotely as a general rule, you're going to have a hard time denying it when there's an accommodation request. You know, these sorts of things. So you need to sort of think in terms about what the parameters are of where remote work works for your company, set those out, and then put them into your policy. Have counsel review the policy, which y'all are all counsel. You can do so ably. Perry and I are always glad to help. But, you know, make sure we're not saying things in our policy that might be, you know, on their face discriminatory and protected classes later, particularly when we're dealing with medical issues and such. But put these things into your policies. So another thing that's important too is just specific about the equipment. If you're issuing equipment to employees, any sort of electronics, if you are going to expect them to return them in good shape, you've got to put some parameters around what that means. You know, so we have some clients that call us and say the employee's computer was stolen out of their car because they left it in visibility sitting in their driveway overnight, unlocked. I mean, that's happened. So, you know, you're going to have to say the things about the policies and the equipment. I mean, excuse me, all of the equipment that you expect. Another thing I would recommend is that it can't be used by anybody else but the employee, and it can't be used for anything other than business purposes. Have them sign for the equipment. And in South Carolina, because of the South Carolina Payment of Wage Act, you're going to want to list the equipment by type and then the value of the equipment. And then your signature form, your consent form has to say, if you're going to deduct from payroll, if they don't return it, that if the employee fails to return the above dash referenced equipment, the employer will deduct the amount above from the employee's paycheck, and that the employee consents to that deduction. You're required to have all of that, the value of it, meaning the monetary value, and that the employee consents to the payroll deduction for their failure to return before you can do the payroll deduction. So then there's obviously the wage issues, the wage and hour issues, and how will you quantify wage and hour for particularly your non-exempt employees. And you're going to need to have some very good measures in place for that. Again, it's going to be policies, and I'm going to want it to also be in the agreement. Also, overtime, you know, so same thing. If you're going to work overtime, you've got to get approval first. All those rules should still apply. If they go ahead and they work overtime and they haven't gotten approval, of course, you've got to pay them, discipline them. If they continue to do it, write them up. If they continue to do it, fire them. A few of those, and then the folks won't continue the behavior. Next slide. So we talked about the agreement and what I would recommend about the agreement, and I hit on some of those already. But one of the things that I think you've got to do if you are going to allow employees to remote work and telework, and this is actually going to apply anytime you allow someone to do social media or any sort of online presence for you. You need to actually have an agreement with them that protects the proprietary nature and trade secret and confidentiality of your information. And that also says this information is company information. You know, down from the email address that the employee is using to communicate with your clients, or putting on social media to any of the social media accounts that the employee access, including the passwords that the employee access on behalf of the employer. So you want to keep all of those things in mind. You do face an increased threat, in my opinion, in our opinion, for teleworking. So they can transfer, copy confidential information from their work computers to their personal devices, or anything that they have at home. So you want to make sure you've got the IT protections in place to track that. Home offices are also more susceptible to threats from hackers. So you're going to need to have strong security policies, and you're going to need to require them to remote in through your database, such as Citrix or any other database like that. You might want to add another level of security for them to access it. You've got to require them at a minimum to sign non-disclosures, confidentialities, and ideas and inventions, so that anything that they're doing on the system on behalf of the employer is the company property and not the employee property. And then include in the agreements that you have, as well as your processes, how you will get this information back if someone decides that they're going to end their employment with you and move on to another employer. How will you get this information back? So these are some things that must be considered. I think that's it. Next slide. All right, great. So kicking it back to Perry.
Thank you, Chris. I think that's all great advice on the compliance side of managing the remote workforce. We do have several questions in the Q&A that I'm going to just attempt to weave into my comments as I talk about the next two topics. We had a question about whether we found remote working engagements to be productive or not. I think it's still somewhat of an open question. Advocates have always said that, remote work leads employees to work longer hours. Productivity of employees is more difficult to measure, and I think that's the big question. I kind of liken it to, these companies that have unlimited PTO or unlimited vacation. That there's a fear that people are just going to take vacation all the time, but it actually leads employees to take less vacation. And I think that's a little bit of a parallel with the remote work study. Some companies think that, employees are just going to be on the couch with a bag of potato chips. And certainly I don't think that is borne out by the statistics. Chris talked about the Unum study, which you can see there. 3/4 of employees were more productive or as productive working remotely. And so some interesting statistics there, but I think we do still have a ways to go. There's another question about how should you adjust your management style to manage an employee remotely. And I'm certainly don't pretend to be a management consultant or expert. I would say that engagement and collaboration, which is kind of the focus of the next slide, really is kind of, I think, the key to making it work. This has really been one of the big concerns of companies in allowing these arrangements, is that if people aren't coming to the office, they're not collaborating, they're not engaged with the workplace and their other coworkers. They're isolated, so they have less of a sense of belonging. So I think from a management perspective, it's incumbent upon you all, if you're in that position, to make sure that collaboration is still there, whether that's through Zoom or Slack. I mean, there's a lot of tools at our disposal now to make sure that happens. I would say, try things that work in your workplace, like social functions and things like that. I would try to make sure that those type of events continue. And I don't know that your management style needs to change per se, but I do think there needs to be an increased focus on communication. I think that would be helpful. And I've got a couple of slides there on just bullet points. I'll probably go through these quickly because I want to make sure we give Lucy enough time. But I think it's, some of these are pretty self-explanatory as far as tips for communicating with employees. The fourth topic is really the benefits of doing this on the HR side of things. And this is pretty interesting to me. Chip asks suggestions for onboarding during a pandemic, and some companies were already doing this, but it's being made a little bit easier. We got guidance from the Department of Homeland Security and ICE on allowing remote examination of I-9 forms, which everybody thought was a really positive development. A lot of companies are doing electronic training and onboarding through Zoom. It cuts down on paper. Potentially, it may force you to start doing things like have your employee handbook virtually. Typically an employee handbook, a lot of employees just sign on the dotted line and put it on the shelf to collect dust. But, this could be an opportunity to do something interactive with employees as far as reviewing what the contents of the employee handbook are. So I think it's definitely a good idea. What I don't think you should do is say, okay, everybody's working remotely, so we're sort of not going to do an onboarding. I would sort of view it as an opportunity to do something new and exciting with respect to onboarding. One interesting thing I think from an HR perspective that Chris made some reference to was this may be a decrease in the burden on HR in managing employee leave. So what I mean by that is, employee leave is always high at the list of HR and in-house counsel's headaches. The FMLA is notoriously difficult to comply with. Leave as an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act is difficult to comply with. And you may just see a decrease in requests for employee leave if employees are working from home. What traditionally was a request to be out of work, for 2 days because the employee's in bed. Well, if you're working from home, maybe that employee can actually, do work at home. And so you may see a decrease in those type of requests. I also think there could be a decrease in workers' comp claims, harassment and discrimination claims, and that type of thing. And Chip did have a question about workers' comp, which was that if an employee injures himself in his home office, is that a workers' comp injury? And this is and following up on that, should we go to the extent of requiring certain safety measures at home, like extension cords and fire extinguishers, et cetera? This is a really interesting issue. I would say, generally speaking, just because the employee is working from home, that does not mean they can't file a workers' comp claim. They can still file a workers' comp claim, but they're going to have potentially a fight with the workers' comp carrier about whether or not they were truly at work when they were injured. So if the employee sets up home office in his kitchen and he's over there making a sandwich and slips on the banana peel in the kitchen, is that work or not? I mean, I think it's going to be a lot more complicated for workers, but it could lead to a decrease in claims. I mean, we're not really sure how that's going to shake out, but it could be a good thing. It'll be interesting to see what OSHA does with respect to guidance on, employers providing a safe workplace for those that are working at home. I do think it's a good idea in creating the policy and the agreement that Chris talked about earlier to put some provisions in there regarding what the workers' comp expectation is and what the safety expectations are in that event. To the extent that you need to go of requiring extension cords and fire extinguishers, I don't know. I mean, are you going to be able to police that? Are you going to go to people's homes and check it? I'm just not sure about that, but I do think it's probably a good idea to at least consider having some of that in the policy and put it on the employee to do that. Discrimination and harassment. I mean, I think that, if there's potentially less face-to-face contact and working in close proximity to each other, I think there could be a decrease there. That would be great if it is. And more satisfied employees always leads to less conflict and less litigation. And Chris referenced the wage and hour which I think is really the big legal challenge for HR, particularly managing tracking of hours and paying overtime for non-exempt employees. So it's 12:40. I do want to give Lucy plenty of time for her side of the presentation. Chris, do I need to toss it back over to you for anything, or straight into Lucy?
I'll say let's hear from Lucy about mental health at the workplace. I will say just very quickly that the COVID, another positive thing about COVID is all of a sudden mental health could become a spoken issue in the workplace, whereas before maybe not so much. So with that, no further ado, nice to hear from Lucy on this.
Good. Thanks, Chris and Perry, and thank y'all for letting me join you today. So I'm Lucy Henry from First Sun Employee Assistance Program, and I'm not going to do an EAP song and dance, but we'll be happy to answer any questions about employee assistance programs at the end as well. But as Chris said, you know, one of the things that we are learning from this pandemic is that mental health is really suffering for a lot of people. And Stephen Taylor, who actually his book on pandemics came out like in February, one of the core things that he says is that the psychological footprint of a pandemic is greater than the medical footprint. And I think we are beginning to see that more and more in the workplace, either from those people that are having to work from home and having to adjust to being at home and having kids at home, or just looking at just change. And, you know, as we know that when we face changes, especially the older we get, the more it taxes our systems and our adrenal systems. And when our adrenal systems are on constant go and cortisol is being dropped because of stress, because we're not sure what's coming next and what the next threat is, and we're living in fear, you know, then that greatly impacts our own psychological makeup. And so, you know, but that's just kind of basic biology as well as psychology. Next slide, please, Julie. So, you know, what is that impact from a mental health standpoint? Well, you know, one of the first things is to look at sleep. You know, either people are not sleeping enough because they're living in fear, they're waking up fearful, they're sleeping too much. So sleep can be very much impacted by the pandemic, and that can be because, you know, you've got too many people at home or not enough people at home. But then also to think about nutrition when we're stressed. So often, what some people like to do is to stress eat. And, you know, I've heard from numerous people, you know, that we're talking about, you know, the COVID-19, and that's the 19 pounds that people are gaining because they're at home and all they want to do is snack all day and not make choices about the food that they're eating, or not eating at regular times because they're home. So, you know, they're eating more, eating things that really aren't necessarily nutritious for them. And one of the things that we need to know too is that, you know, there very much is a stress response when sleep and nutrition are not managed. So that again continues to tax our own stress system. And then in that, we also have just substance use and the fact that, you know, people may not be going out to, you know, have a cocktail or a beer with friends or coworkers, but it's much easier to go and get it and have it at home, and it's more accessible. So folks, increased substance use is certainly at risk. And then especially those folks who may be in recovery from substance use and dealing with the stress could be a relapse trigger. And then, of course, we're looking at folks with chronic illness. And again, chronic illness being triggered by stress, and the stress of change and having to adapt, or not having a normal routine, so to speak. And then, of course, isolation. And I think we're seeing, you know, the isolation impact, especially in older adults, and older adults who are not being able to have the socialization and the care that they need. And then that impacting even employees because they're worried about parents or grandparents or older siblings or, you know, those kind of things, but people, and not being able to even be the hands-on caregivers that they need to be, or that they haven't spent so much time caring for them that the workplace is being impacted in that way. Okay, next slide, Keely. So when we think about well-being, and you know, I like to look at this in terms of just kind of 6 ways, and what we want to look at in terms of increasing morale in the workplace is to have employees, you know, look at what does it mean for me, or for as an individual, for me to thrive, and where do I fit in each of these 6 components? You know, the 6 components being emotional, occupational, intellectual, spiritual, physical, and social. But emotional, in recognizing, you know, my emotions, our emotions, how I may be reacting to things that normally 6 months ago wouldn't have even created an emotional reaction. To recognize the sadness, the grief, the loneliness, the anxiety, the depression, and recognize, you know, what do I need? What do you need? What does my employee need in order to be thriving from an emotional standpoint in the midst of that? And so often it is even just being able to name those emotions, but also being able to look at from an occupational standpoint. You know, my job has changed a lot. You know, I may not be going to work every day. I may not be, you know, talking to somebody in the kitchen or at the water cooler or popping in to see people. And that goes along with social as well. But where am I, how am I thriving in my job? What do I need? What challenge is there? Or are there too many challenges? What do I need to take off my plate? You know, so often even in the midst of a pandemic and being at home and the isolation, is that we end up taking on more and more and more, and yet we're not accomplishing the things that we need to do. So focusing on, you know, what are the main things that need to be done from an occupational standpoint. And then also from an intellectual standpoint, and so often that can even go with an emotional and occupational. These all really do fit together, but intellectually, how are people being stimulated? Where are the conversations? Where is the learning? And then spiritually, making meaning, finding meaning in the everyday, and looking at, you know, what does it mean to be grateful, to express gratitude. And then physically, you know, I think especially early on, people were encouraged to get outside, to exercise. You know, we saw families walking or riding bikes. And of course, as this has gone on for 6 months, you're not seeing as much of that. But how, from a physical standpoint, do we actually challenge our bodies? Do we take care of our bodies physically? Because we know that, you know, even 10 minutes of some kind of exercise, walking, cycling, swimming, any of that can change our brains and can help us to be better. And then again, socially, because we're having to find creative ways to socialize. And again, you know, as this has gone on, we deal with Zoom fatigue and not necessarily wanting to socialize so much, you know, over social media or over Zoom or FaceTime or whatever. But people are missing out on that social connection and the social cues that you get from being in the presence of somebody, but finding ways to actually continue to enhance the social aspect of our psyche. So that's kind of the well-being. But then we, you know, want to look at, you know, what do we need to continue to flourish? And as we're talking about morale, you know, I think so much, I want to be able to put a positive spin on what has been, you know, so often what we think about as being negative in this COVID crisis. But we're trying to find the positive and to find, you know, what are the things that we look at? How do we look at things? So we begin to change kind of even our perspective, to do paradigm shifts. And the first is really in, looking at positive emotions. So this model is from Martin Seligman, who is the father of positive psychology, and it's from his book, Flourish. And he calls it the PERMA model. So that positive emotion, to look at gladness, to look for gratitude, being able to find things to look forward to, that really helps with positive well-being. And the second being engagement. And again, we're having to learn new ways to engage, but beginning with where we are right now and engaging in the present, being mindful, looking at what's surrounding us. And as we again, think about those things that are positive, but to be into that state of flow. And then the third is the relationships and how we relate to others and finding new ways to do that. How do we enhance those relationships? Maybe even finding ways to be able to say, I need to engage in this relationship differently. Maybe I need to say every day I want to reach out to another person, but that is going to increase morale. And then, of course, finding that meaning, finding the things that we can do to move us forward. And as we know that we are at our best selves when we're doing something that is bigger than who we are. So again, creatively coming together, it might be that as a work group, being able to say, let's support this one nonprofit together in some way. And you might not be able to go do hands-on activities, but to learn. So I'm going to use an example of a local Greenville nonprofit that I'm involved with, but Rebuild Upstate, which is a nonprofit that works to actually keep people in their homes, to enhance those homes. But how might a work group come together like that and to learn about the work that somebody like Rebuild Upstate is doing, or the Julie Valentine Center, but to learn about that and then challenge the work group to do something as a group that's a little different than what you might have done a year. And then that leads to that sense of accomplishment. But well-being is about almost being able to celebrate wins every day and to be able to say, in the midst of this crisis, in the midst of all that's going on, what did I do well? What did I accomplish that really helped me feel good, and to celebrate that win? So again, as we're looking to increase morale, looking at these are some ways to begin to do that in the midst of the mental health kind of crisis. Okay, next slide. And then it's all about self-care. And self-care in so many ways, it's something that we want to put to the side. We want to take care of everybody else. But to even ask yourselves, to ask your work groups, how are you being flexible? What have you learned from having to do things differently? And really, again, celebrating the win with that. Asking what brings you joy. But then also finding ways to create time out, to be able to pause and to reflect. And that having those people that you lean on, the support system, whatever that might be. But in the whole purpose and perspective of self-care, we learn when we fly that you have to put the oxygen mask on ourselves first. And in the same way, in the midst of crisis, in the midst of change, in the midst of everything that's not being the way we want it to be, we have to take care of ourselves first. We have to breathe in that oxygen so that we might be able to take care of other people. One more slide. So, and then of course, within the workplace, how do we create that atmosphere of positive morale? And that in itself is being able to be empathetic by having a place for those in the workplace to even just to talk about their emotions, to talk about how difficult this could be. As managers, to really look at individual employees in unconditional positive regard, to be able to hear and not to judge, but to let them talk about what's going on. The importance, in this is about how do we connect to our workplace and the values of the workplace, but also how are we as individuals contributing to work and sharing that with one another in a different way. So much about positive morale in the workplace really is about how employees are heard. And especially when things are difficult, to be able to say, this is safe, tell us what you're feeling, checking in with one another, even in the workplace, being able to say, let's have one day a week where we're just going up and we're asking somebody, are you okay? Are you checking in? Maybe it's a text message, maybe it's an email, but to be able to be compassionate and empathetic that not everyone is okay right now, but there are ways to be able to work towards others being okay. And then one more slide. And then just to look at gratitude. And we know that there are more and more studies coming out of how we might, how being grateful and actually writing down things of gratitude changes our brains. So in the midst of crisis, as we make, jotting down those things that bring us joy, as we're pausing for a moment, just to be able to say, to watch the sunset and to be thankful for that. To look at, wildlife or your children, or just to be able to share laughter. But passing that on to others is such a great way of sharing gratitude. And again, it goes back to as our bodies, as our psyches, are dealing with the stress and the change, when we work to find those positive things, that compensates for all that negativity. So the positive really does win out. Yeah, I think there's one more slide. Oh, that's it. Give it back to you, Chris.
So thanks, Lucy, as always. And the PERMA model is particularly interesting. It is a great opportunity to have these sessions for your employees, these wellness sessions, if they're remote or in person. It's a great opportunity to be doing that. It's a great time to be doing any training that you need to be doing if you've got a lot of folks that are in their seats rather than on the road. It's just a great opportunity to take advantage of communicating better with your employees and letting them know that you're there for them. Definitely a lot of positive things that can come out of how your company does business and communicates with their employees through these times. And so the three of us, all three of us, if I can speak on behalf of all three of us, are all very thankful to be given an opportunity to speak with all of you. And we at HSB always love participating in any ACC function. I'm glad to help you with anything we can. And as I said at the outset, please subscribe to our blog and let us hear from you if there's anything else that you would want to talk about or discuss, or how remote work and telework issues are going at your office. Anything that we can hear about that is good for us to know. Anything else, Perry?
No, thanks everybody.
Thanks, guys. That was some awesome information. We really appreciate you guys not only sponsoring our chapter, but taking the time to give us the inside scoop on workplace morale these days. Just a reminder, be sure to answer that question at the very end to receive CLE credit. If you have any issues, please feel free to reach out via email and we can take care of those for you. ACC South Carolina chapter will be providing these materials in the program materials section on our website as soon as possible. So keep checking back for those. And with that being said, we'll give you guys a goodbye. Thank you.
Great, thank you.